Okay. Hi, everybody. Hi. We're having an interesting start this morning, but great turnout. Thank you guys so much for coming. I'm really excited. And as I said, we've got lots of people joining us online. Okay. Sorry, we don't have a microphone, but we've got, I think 75, 80 something people joining us online. So good crowd. We're gonna get started with an introduction by Ranger Andrew. Andrew Astley used to work at Martin Van Buren with us, and he actually had the pleasure of interviewing Dr. Myers, who's the woman who wrote the book we're discussing today. And so he talked to her in 2019. And so we're gonna have him do a little quick intro for us, just so that we're all kind of caught up to who Julia is and the time period. And then Ranger Zach and Mia, Melissa, and Ranger Dawn are all gonna share a little bit, a point of view or a presentation. So we're each gonna talk for a few minutes about a different aspect of the topic. Right, there we go. Andrew, can you hear me? You wanna get started?
Yeah, thank you very much, Melissa. Can everybody hear me okay?
Yes.
All right. Again, I'm Andrew Astley, currently a park ranger at New River Gorge National Park and Preserve in wild and wonderful West Virginia, but formerly in the mists of antiquity from 2016 to about 2021, park ranger at Martin Van Buren National Historic Site. And I'm really excited to be here today, so thank you for including me. Julia Chinn is a fascinating character and one I'm really interested in learning about. So I'm lucky to be here to share it with you. So there's a lot of ground to cover here, so I apologize if this is pretty rapid fire. I'm going to try to keep this pretty quick, but this is a really expansive topic, so if I miss something, I'm sure one of my colleagues will fill us in as we go along. But to get started, basically, Julia Chinn is, in many ways, I feel like, both an incredibly extraordinary individual historically, and also sort of tragically, in a lot of ways, pretty common in a lot of ways for her story. Julia Chinn was born in Kentucky sometime around 1797. We're not 100% sure of a concrete date, but she was born enslaved to the Johnson family on one of their properties. And they were sort of one of the founding families of Kentucky. In sort of northern central Kentucky, they owned a ton of land there. And Julia will be born into that family as an enslaved person. And at some point in her teenage years, sort of the most critical juncture for sort of the launching point for our story, is going to become involved in a sexual relationship with the fifth son of that family, Richard Johnson. And we have no idea how Julia felt about this relationship. None of her own sort of words have been passed down to us over the years. But the power dynamics of this situation make considering terms like consent or really trying to wrap our heads around this relationship problematic at best. But ultimately, in many ways, this relationship is going to define, at least in terms of time, the vast majority of Julia's life. Julia will be taken to Blue Springs Farm, the plantation that Richard Mentor Johnson is going to live on in Scott County, Kentucky, for the rest of her life. And Johnson never frees Julia, despite this relationship. And she will be laboring for him in various unfree capacities for the rest of her life. She will be an organizer, a mistress of the manor, a housekeeper. She will give and raise 2 children for Richard Mentor Johnson. But that is going to be sort of the defining state of the rest of her life until she dies in a cholera outbreak in the 1830s. Now, that in and of itself is sort of the tragically common part. Julia's sexual exploitation and unfree labor is the story of tens of thousands, if not more, of enslaved women over the course of antebellum history. But what's extraordinary is, I think, sort of 2 things. The first is simply that we know a comparatively enormous amount about Julia Chinn. Historically, we do not know all of that much, at least in specifics, about the vast majority of people who are enslaved in the United States. There's a lot of factors for that. One of them is simply that history has not cared about most enslaved people in specifics for the vast majority of our history. But ultimately, we know a ton about Julia, comparatively speaking. And a lot of the other extraordinary things come down to the details of Julia's life. Perhaps the most critical is that Johnson refers to Julia, a woman that he is enslaving, as his wife in public. And this is profoundly controversial in a way that's sort of difficult to overstate for the time period. Johnson, unlike most white people who are sexually exploiting African American enslaved people, is not married to a white woman at any point during his life. So it seems like in his mind, he is married to Julia Chinn. Of course, he could not legally be married to Julia Chinn. Interracial marriage will be illegal in Kentucky and most of the rest of the United States for quite a long time after this. But it seems as though, in his mind at least, he is married to Julia. Again, that doesn't change the reality of the fact that he never frees her. But she does experience, because of this relationship, a degree of privilege that is sort of unusual, although she is constantly reminded of the limits of that privilege. And what I mean by that is things like she is essentially managing his estate while he's in Washington, D.C. for 6 months out of the year. She is in some ways in charge of a few of the white workers on the plantation, whether that's the overseer or the headmaster of the Native American school that's on Johnson's plantation, which is like a whole nother element of the story that I'm not going to get too deep into right now. And the local community seems to just sort of have to put up with this, whether that's because they are gaining something financially from Richard Mentor Johnson or simply because of the clout he has in this community. But ultimately, again, she is constantly reminded of the limits of that privilege. When Johnson tries to have her ride in a carriage through town, that's where the community draws a line in the sand, because that's how white women travel, and that's not acceptable for Julia. Her family members continue to be enslaved by Johnson, and although she is to some degree able to shelter those members of the family, they're never that far away from being sold down river into the deep South. So the situation is constantly tenuous. But ultimately, what sort of makes this, sort of elevates all of this, and I think why we really know so much about Julia, is because she gets quite close to the center of American society. Richard Mentor Johnson will eventually run to be vice president of the United States alongside Martin Van Buren. And critically, at this point, Julia has passed away. She is no longer alive by the time this happens. And yet she casts an enormous shadow over the rest of Johnson's life because of their relationship. She will appear in political cartoons, which I believe are going to be shown a little bit later in this presentation, despite the fact that she's gone. And so she gets quite close to the center of American life as a result of this, and is perhaps why we know, comparatively speaking, so much about her today. So we're going to delve a little bit into the specifics and a lot more sort of discussion about that, but that's sort of the bird's eye view of Julia. And we're going to get a bit more into the specifics, I suppose, here.
Cool. Thanks, Andrew. Okay, so I mentioned my name is Melissa, and I just want to do a quick note, set some expectations for our meeting today. We're going to cover a lot of ground, and we're going to talk about some pretty big things. We're talking about slavery and race and gender, and we are definitely not going to get to the bottom of any of these things today. So I just want to say this is more about a survey of the story, an introduction, and really the whole goal is that we start conversations. So if you take Dr. Meyer's book to your local book club with you, that'd be great. If you take the story of Julia Chinn home with you today and you share it with friends and family, that's really what we're trying to do here, is just start the conversation. And see if my slides are working. So we're gonna, there we go. Okay, I thought I'd start with this. This is a quote from Dr. Myers. Language from the 18th and 19th centuries often doesn't match that of our own time. This is the very first sentence of the book, and for very good reason. As we discussed Julia today, we're going to be using some language that is accurate to primary sources of the time, but it's not the way we talk about things today. And we're going to look at some political cartoons and some newspaper ads that might be offensive or hard to look at. Nothing too terrible, but just by the fact of the way that things have changed in 200 years. So also I wanted to tell you that you're going to hear some terms you may not be familiar with. I'll give you a couple of examples of some language that was used in the United States when it was a slaveholding society versus the way scholars talk about things today. And this is the way that the National Park Service talks about things, because we actually have standards on language about such things. The big one you'll hear is enslaved person, which is the way we try to talk about people who were enslaved. We try not to say slave, we use the noun slave. In some circumstances, it makes sense and it's accurate. But in general, when we're talking about the people, we try to say enslaved person. And this, for me, is a way to remember and honor the humanity of the people who were kept in bondage and held in conditions without basic human rights. So it's a person-first language. So instead of saying a group of slaves look out there, we say, oh, there were some people who lived in those places and they were enslaved. Try to preserve some of the humanity. So that's something that you'll hear that's that may not be familiar. Also, for instance, instead of using the word master, we think that is a euphemism. And so we try to be really clear and honest. And so we will say usually someone is a slaveholder or an enslaver or a person who enslaved people. And so those are just some examples of the way that we talk about things. But that's not the final word on any of this. Language is always evolving. So everybody is welcome to use their own terminology, but just so you guys know where we're coming from. And for more information on this, we have some sites here. This is a language guide from the Frederick Douglass site, and another one from Arlington House, the Robert Lee Memorial in Virginia. They both have been doing some great work on this kind of topics. Let's see. So my first question to you guys, was Julia Chinn Black? And this may seem like a simple question or a complicated question, depending on what you're thinking about it. One of the things you may be surprised to learn today is race is not actually a biological category. So scientists today tell us that race is not a useful scientific term or reality. So that basically the Western concept of race is seen now to be a result of white supremacy and colonization. And so, as it said here, it's not a biological reality. There are no real biological differences that you can categorize neatly in a scientific way. It is, however, a social reality because we believe it to be so. And so it is still really important, and we still can talk about race because it is something that people believe in and make choices, and it really affects people still. So in the 19th century, it was very much believed that race was a biological reality, although nobody really agreed on the science of it. There were lots of different terms that came up with all these complicated terminology to describe different skin colors. The color line was a term used by both Frederick Douglass and W.E.B. Du Bois, among others, in the late 1800s. It could refer to racial segregation, the physical division enforced by Jim Crow laws, the line that was crossed if a Black person married a white person, or it could refer to how someone was perceived. For the example, the idea of passing for white could be referred to as crossing the color line. Dr. Myers in the book, it's right here, and it's a beautiful book. Surmises it's likely that Julia's father was a white man named Chinn, given the many references to how light-skinned Julia was. She concludes Julia was most likely a mixed race person, but she makes the choice to refer to her as Black. So Dr. Myers chooses to refer to Julia as Black because she believes that's how Julia would see herself. She was born to an enslaved person, and just by virtue of that alone would have probably been considered Black, no matter what she looked like. So as Andrew mentioned, even though Julia died in 1833, before Richard Mentor Johnson became vice president, it was just after her death. So in 1835, 1836, when Johnson and Van Buren are running that it becomes a really big topic nationally. So Julia becomes national news. We have a lot of cartoons that start popping up and editorials about it. So this was not a secret then, everybody knew. And so this is one, this famous one called An Affecting Scene in Kentucky, where Richard is saying, when I read this girlless attacks in the newspapers on the mother of my children, my friends, I give way to my feelings. Dear girls, please bring me your mother's picture so that I may show my friends. And so these are ostensibly the daughters of Julia and Richard, Adeline and Imogene. And they have with them a picture of what the author of this cartoon believes Julia looks like. It's definitely a woman of African descent wearing some maybe traditional African clothes. The fact is that Julia, like I said, was born a slave, and so she would have been considered Black. Her two daughters were also born to an enslaved woman, so throughout the course of their lives, they crossed the color line, and by which I mean they grow up to marry white men, and legally, and in the church, in the case of one of them, and their children will go on to be considered white, and their children's children will be considered white. And it's not even until Dr. Myers comes knocking on some of their doors that they realize who their ancestors were. And so the story had been lost, but also the idea of their having a Black ancestor was lost. So my second question to you today would be what if one day a scholar or a historian or a long lost cousin knocks on your door or messages you on Facebook and says to you that you are descended from Julia Chinn and Richard Mentor Johnson. How does that make you feel about the story of Julia? Does it change the way you feel about her? Does it change who you are? And so that's sort of some of the questions about what does it mean to be Black, to be white, and sort of now versus then, still an ongoing thing. We're all taking ancestry tests and trying to figure this stuff out. Yeah, that's my section.
Good, okay. So just again, before I get started.
Sorry, I forgot to point out.
Yes. More.
I have one more thing. That is a picture of Julia that I believe an artist created for a recent PBS series, and it's been floating around the internet. I can't find who it is yet. I have called up. But anyways, just to point out, we have two very different versions of what Julia looks like. And so both of these are Julia and neither of these are Julia because we have no known portrait of you. All right, now I'm done.
Okay. So just again, before I kind of go into my little segment here, I'm really focusing on family. And kind of the things that were threatening Julia and her family, maybe trying to influence some of the decisions she made throughout her life. So just before I go into just really these advertisements bearing in mind, I also do have an illustration that might be a little bit difficult to look at. So I want to give one last reminder. So real quick, family, we typically, most of us can relate to that. I am the youngest of the whole family of 5. I have a mother, a father, and 2 older sisters. Julia, she has a mother. She, like Melissa mentioned, has a likely white father. She also has a husband, if you will, in Richard Mentor Johnson, and she has 2 daughters, Adeline and Amrita. So kind of to go through with that, I'm going to ask my question at the end, kind of like an introspective what you think about it, but there's a lot that we can't say for certain, and Andrew did a very good job at introducing Julia. So and comparatively, we know a lot more about Julia than other enslaved people, especially enslaved women. But we still have a lot of unknowns. What we can't say for certain, Julia likely took great risks to keep her family safe and together. She served as an overseer of Blue Spring Farm for Richard Mentor Johnson while he was away. That included going into contracts with people in the town. It also included managing the other enslaved people, which included her brother and sister-in-law, Daniel and Patience, at the facility. That would have been, very interesting conversations. It was certainly something unusual that we were not used to hearing about or seeing. And something that Dr. Myers is really good at, she does not want to list Julia as a heroine. Her story is not about being a hero or a villain. It's about a means of survival and to hope to secure a better future for her daughters, again, Adeline and Imogene. So something typical to note as well is that Julia gets to keep her family together, but that's not without cost. It's not without, scares and fear. She has, again, her brother, her sister-in-law, the patients at Blue Spring Farm with her. She gets to keep her daughters with her. But Julia witnessed firsthand just how quickly that can almost change. In 1821, the fall of 1821, Richard actually chooses to mortgage her brother Daniel and sister-in-law Patience. The reason being, he had a lot of debt. He needed to pay off his debts. And so he thinks to sell some of his enslaved people or at least mortgage them. So even though Daniel and Patience never actually are physically sold off Blue Spring Farm, Julia came that close to losing with her family. And that probably influenced some of her decisions throughout the rest of her time at Blue Spring Farm. Julia also has her mother to look to. Her mother's name was Henrietta, and Henrietta's experience is also a sad one. It's where Julia was born to Jemima, the Suckett family. And there, Henrietta, in a manner of a couple days, loses both her daughter, Julia, and her son, Daniel, to Blue Spring Farm. She's not certain she'll ever get to see them again. At this point in time, she can no longer protect them. She couldn't cook for them, care for them when they're sick, or protect Julia from sexual assault. And while to her, 2 miles might as well have been 200 miles. There is no record of exactly how Henrietta reacted at the news of losing her children to Blue Spring Farm, but reactions varied across records of other accounts. Some women threw fits of rage. Some committed suicide. And Margaret Garner, another example, actually committed infanticide rather than see her children taken from her and returned to slavery. The lengths people will go to try and keep their family, prevent them from being traded further into slavery was very prominent. And Dr. Myers, from a direct quote from her book, something that just kind of really resonated with me was, every enslaved parent feared being separated from their children. They all knew that their owner's deaths could lead to Black families being torn apart to raise money or to fulfill inheritances. And again, that's right from Dr. Myers' book. So while we lack Julia's full story, we can theorize by looking at the narratives of other enslaved people. In a story separate of Julia, we learn of an enslaved woman named Rose. You know that one, yeah. Rose was faced with the imminent sale of her 9-year-old daughter, Ashley. Ashley was then sold and separated from her mother in a fate known all too well. In other situations, we can look at examples like this advertisement seen right here. This one is from 1835 in Charleston, South Carolina, and reads, "Cash. All persons that have slaves to dispose of will do well by giving me a call, as I will give the highest price for men, women, and children." And that was signed by Mr. Thomas Griggs. There were also calls from mothers desperate for information about their children. The next advertisement ran in Richmond, Virginia in 1866. And it says, "Wanted information in relation to my children, Nancy, Ben, Polly, Tempa, Isham Bailey, who formerly belonged to Ben Prince of Sussex County. If any of them are living, or if any person can give me information of them, they will confer a great favor. Address me in this city, care of Mr. George Fisher," signed Mary Bailey. There also been a recurring bout of fear every New Year's. To us now, New Year's is a celebration, it's joyous. Unfortunately, many enslaved people, especially in parts of the South, like Kentucky, January 1st was referred to as the Slave Hiring Day or Heartbreak Day, as African-American abolitionist William Cooper Nell described it. Because enslaved people spent New Year's Eve waiting, wondering if their owners were going to contract them out to someone else, therefore potentially splitting up their families. Some of these contracts were bounded by a handshake of the man's good word. Others were a bit more in depth, some paperwork required, a stricter contract. And the contract would run from January 1st, New Year's Day, to December 25th, Christmas Day. There was a little gap here, it was usually filled with family celebrations, trying to be together before possibly being torn apart come New Year's Day. The renting out of slave labor was a relatively common practice in antebellum America, and a profitable practice for white slave owners and hirers. Ads flooded the newspapers before slave auctions filled town squares in nearly every sizable city of slaveholding states. Even though no record exists of Julia experiencing this directly within her own family, it is likely she knew people affected by it. Lewis Clark, in an 1842 account talking about New Year's Day, says, of all days in the year that slaves dread, New Year's Day is the worst of any. On New Year's Day, we went to the auctioneer's block to be hired to the highest bidder for 1 year. That's written in an 1861 memoir from Philadelphia, in which he described having been hired out 3 times away from his family. That's where the saying comes from, that what you do on New Year's Day, you'll be doing all the rest of New Year. That was another account by Sister Harrison in an interview in 1937. The next one here is actually from Harriet Jacobs, so another story separate of Julia's. She wrote a very detailed account in the Slaves' New Year's Day chapter of her 1861 autobiography. Hiring Day at the South takes place on the 1st of January. On the 2nd, the slaves are expected to go to their new masters, their new enslavers. She observes slave owners and farmers renting out their human chattel for extra income during the period between the cotton and corn harvests and the next planting season. From Christmas to New Year's Eve, many families would wait anxiously to find out whether they'd be rented out and to whom. And on New Year's Day, at the appointed hour, the grounds are thronged with men, women, and children, waiting like criminals to hear their doom pronounced. And one of these days, Jacob saw a mother lead 7 children to the auction block. She knew that some of them would be taken from her, but instead they took all of her children. The slave trader who took the children wouldn't tell her where he was taking them because it depended on where he could get the highest price. Jacob said she would never forget the mother crying out, "Gone, all gone. Why don't God kill me?" Next one for me. So this is might be very hard to look at illustration. This is really kind of looking at an auction block, a situation of an auction. We have a weeping and begging mother reaching for her child being cruelly held by the auctioneer. This illustration is from Henry Bibb's narrative of the life and adventures of Henry Bibb, an American slave. Henry Bibb himself escaped slavery in 1838 and eventually became a leading figure in the fugitive slave community in Canada. In his memoir, he described this scene. The slaves were offered on the auction blocks one after another until they were all sold before their old master's face. After the men were all sold, then they sold the women and children. They ordered the first woman to lay her child on the mount block. She refused to give her little one and clung to it as long as she could. In all reality, this very easily could have been Julia. Had Richard listened to his mother Jemima and taken a white wife, had Julia fallen out of favor with Richard at any point in time, or any other possible scenarios could have played out that could have placed Julia in this exact same position. Now, there's also an attachment to, or an example from New York. I am originally from Georgia. I did not know that slavery existed in New York State. We were not taught that. So I was a bit surprised when I first moved up here, really started diving into history of enslavement in New York State here. So this is additionally a Dutch American enslavers regularly separated young children from their mothers, as seen here in this 1797 ad. To read it out loud, it says, "For sale, a remarkable, smart, healthy Negro wench, about 22 years of age, used to both housework and farming, and sold for no fault but want of employ. She has a child about 9 months old, which will be at the purchaser's option." 1797, a mother could potentially be losing her 9-month-old child. And that's just, to me, tragedy. So in closing here, my last little bit is, while we can't be certain of all the risks, again, Julia took to preserve her family, their well-being, and their future. These were the outcomes she was trying to avoid for her own family. An unfree woman in a hostile time and place led Julia to become complicit in helping to maintain slaves so her kin could possibly acquire upward social mobility, as Melissa talked about crossing the color line. She was at 15 or 16 years old when she had her first child, and therefore was likely fearful for herself and any children she brought into this world. At the same time, Richard was in his early 30s, her enslaver. Just because Richard had fathered a child with her, that meant really no long-standing safety or protections for herself or for her children. This also was not a consensual relationship, as an enslaved person could never consent. The institution of slavery does not permit for discussions of consent. Enslaved adults and children were completely unprotected by any legal means. Julia's power was limited strictly to the bounds of Blue Spring Farm and potentially the church she and Richard attended. At the end of the day, and to many, she was nothing more than a slave woman, property that Richard owned. So my question, kind of for some self-reflection maybe, is what lengths have you taken, or could you see yourself capable of taking to protect a member or members of your own family? And with that, we will go to Dawn.
We want questions
Or
for
questions?
I can't see the chat, but I don't know if Tammy has any questions.
Or breathe or moment even.
There's nothing, no questions online yet.
20 minutes in here.
I have a question. You didn't mention how old Julia and Daniel were when they left their mother.
So I believe when oh, sorry, yes.
Oh, sorry, just so you guys can all hear, she's asking how old were Julia and Daniel when they left Henrietta, to move to Blue Spring?
I don't know if it mentions Daniel's age, but Julia's age was very likely 14 years old at the time. Some of the questioning comes in from what her birth year actually was. There are some records that say 1790, others say 1797, 1796. There's a lot of unknowns, but likely around 14 years old for Julia when she was first sent to Blue Spring Farm.
When Richard Johnson was absent from his plantation and Julia was in charge, do we have any information of how she interacted with the other people enslaved?
Jay's asking, so when Mr. Johnson was away, as he often was, to Washington or to other places for politics, he did leave Julia in charge. And some of her duties, and yes, Dr. Myers goes into pretty great detail about what she would have been left in charge with, and we know that based on Richard's letters. We have no surviving letters from Julia, but we know that she and Richard wrote lots of letters back and forth because we have some of his letters. So again, unfortunately, we don't have Julia thought about these things, but according to Richard. So she would be, as Andrew briefly mentioned, the Choctaw Academy that's in Kentucky. This is a really huge other story that we could talk all about in another program. And it was basically a boarding school for well-off Native American children. So like the sons of important Native Americans could come to Choctaw Academy and get an education funded by the government. And Johnson did this again because of his great debt. He was given a large sum from the government to run this academy. He ran it with a white schoolmaster who also taught Julia's children, Emma Jean and Adeline, in their own home, not at the academy. But almost every day he would go to Julia's home. She had a separate home on the estate with her daughters and teach the daughters. So they were incredibly well educated, like high level, like read classics and Latin and things like that. Sorry, got distracted. So that's the Choctaw Academy. And so Julia helped run that. She and Patience and some of the other women would have done all the sewing. So they basically made all the clothes for the men at the academy and the boys at the academy. They did all the laundry. They made all the food. So yeah, they basically did all of the running of the academy, as well as the running of the house and the estate. And Julia would also be like an overseer. So there were times where she was having to take on the role of an overseer or a slave owner. And as Dr. Myers put it, for her, it was either enslave or be enslaved. And so there wasn't, we don't know what kind of agency Julia had in those situations. But she did have a real position of authority, as well as all of the other housekeeping and bookkeeping and all of that. Yes, Jane.
One thing I remember from the book is that she was also a hostess.
Oh,
So
yeah.
Lafayette visited, and she hosted and planned this huge banquet. She would, and what was it, Madison? One of the presidents came, And she would have been responsible for doing all of the entertainment, providing all of the food, making sure the right people were invited, and she did all of that.
Yeah, great point. She hosted a huge, when General Lafayette did a tour, if anybody's in history buff, they know General Lafayette. And he visited all the towns and he was very celebrated and feted. So when he came to Kentucky, of course, the family, the farm was, put up a huge celebration for him. And yes, so Julia was the hostess. So she served as, in that role as a wife too, is that when people came and they did a lot of entertaining at the farm, she would host them.
Do you have any information about Julia's father? I mean, it seems to me that, I know language is changing, but these enslaved women were all raped. And it's not yet used, and I'm wondering when they're going to change it. Because Julia essentially was the result of a rape. And so was, in a way, her daughters, I'm assuming, because she wasn't legally married.
Yes,
And that bothers me even today. It's about time that we used the correct language, and I'm wondering if there is a movement to do that.
yes.
Because these women were all raped, and many of them were underage.
Yes, Julia was very underage for sure. She was,
Thank you.
so by some accounts, 13, 14, 15. Yes, okay, so first the question is, do we know anything about Julia's father? We do not. As far as I know, Dr. Myers is guessing. She makes an educated guess that he was perhaps a white man named Chinn, with the last name of Chinn, because there are families named Chinn, white families, in Kentucky, and that she and her brother both took that as a last name, and that was not her mom's last name. So that's kind of where that guess comes from. The second part of what you're talking about, yes, it's very much on our minds that these women were all sexually assaulted and were in sexually coercive relationships. And that is one of the things that we talk about, and I can't find it in here. Okay, so I have these language guides. If anyone's interested, you can pick one up. I don't have that many, but I'll also send you the link. These are the ones from Arlington. And one of the things they talk about is this, that we are very much trying to say, we don't say mistress, we don't say concubine. These are all very outdated terms. There it is. We say victim of sexual assault, victim of a non-consenting relationship. So that is in fact the terminology that we all try to use today when we talk about this. And so, yeah, we don't say mistress or girlfriend or whatever, because all of that would imply some kind of consent, which there, as Zach pointed out, there's no way that you can give consent when you're enslaved. And beyond that, a lot of these women were underage. So that's another way that we will not believe that they can give consent.
The same with Sally Hemings. She was indeed Thomas Jefferson's daughter's like playmate, or many times they would have children together. And oh, okay. And when they were in Paris, I think she was 14. That is when he began a sexual relationship with her. And from what I've read, and you know, today these men would be considered pedophiles. They'd be arrested, wouldn't they?
Yeah, it's definitely illegal for sure. And I mean, maybe this is a good time for Dawn. Dawn is talk a little bit about other women like Sally Hemings.
Before I dive in, there's also a part in the book, and I think all three of us may have to share part, because I don't know if I know the whole story, but when Julia is overseeing the school for Native American boys and young men, and also overseeing the household, enslaved household servants, correct me if I'm not explaining this right. All of those topics kind of come together because these young students come from a culture where there are enslaved Black people, and they don't see Black women as having the role that Julia had. So that may not be the complete backstory, but.
No, yeah, you're correct. There was incidents described.
And then there's one specific incident that, and this kind of ties into the idea of sexual assault. or rape, where some of the students, they try to gain access to enslaved Black women in Richard Mentor Johnson's house. And he is outraged by that. I don't know if he was on the plantation when it happened, or he was away during his political career. When all of this, he gets wind of this, he there is some consequence for the young men. The consequence for the enslaved women is that they are punished with a beating. And that, like, it made my blood pressure go up when I was reading this book. And that tags on to what you were saying, you know, like there's about having these conversations and trying to create a safe space for us, because it's maybe we're hearing it for the first time, to bring those kinds of topics out for conversation. And I saw, since I moved myself over there, some reactions on people in the audience, and it's and Zach was saying too, it's very difficult. And this is going to be a tangent. Park Rangers are good at that. We had a meetup last year at our park. We called it a charrette, where these kinds of conversations were begun, and we're having, I think I'm right, part 2 here in another month or so, and that will continue to inform our programs, and also our Facebook posts and some content on our website.
It's a learning process, and we're all learning it too, so we're just inviting you all to join us.
The other part of, with the question regarding rape, part of the problem is that we're trying to use, you know, like I said in the beginning, what we know now and what the laws are now. But when you look back at that time, rape didn't protect that woman because she wasn't white. So, I mean, in a way, it's not historically accurate to describe it as rape, to encourage people to describe it as rape, like, you know, from a legal sense.
I've heard that kind of opinion before, and
Hey, I'm sorry.
Yeah, go back
Just
to
to
the-
refer back to this, so again, this
We
is kind of like the current, almost the current standard is by Arlington House Robert E. Lee Memorial in Virginia. They're the ones kind of like leading the charge in this new way we're discussing about the, you know, topics like this, like sexual assault. And so the reason why they're using sexual assault and as their like definition basis is that basically, like you said, the law did not protect Black women or Black people at that time. So the only law that could be invoked was if a white man who was not the slaveholder assaulted them. In which case the slaveholder could legally charge the other white man with trespassing on his property. So it wasn't a sexual assault charge, it wasn't a rape charge, it was property.
but just because it wasn't illegal then doesn't mean we don't call it rape now.
For sure.
Thank you.
Is there not some element of these descriptions that were used in the 19th century and before that were deliberately constructed to soften the situation, right? These aren't random word choices, right? Like master, and they're very deliberately chosen. And just like issues with sexual assault, rape, right? They were.
Yeah, no, this is a good point. I don't know if everyone can hear Megan, but she was saying that part of this discussion is that this is white supremacy uses a lot of tools, and one of them is this kind of language and euphemism, and so yeah, a lot of this our way of understanding these things may be colored by language that we don't use anymore. So that's kind of why we're trying to not use the historical terms. Yeah, because we need to get lost in that. But I agree with what Megan said. Yes.
I have a question from the chat. Was Kentucky included in the Emancipation Proclamation? How did slavery in Kentucky compare with states like Mississippi or Florida?
Andrew?
Can you guys hear me?
Yeah.
So Kentucky, yes, would have been Kentucky would have been excluded from the Emancipation Proclamation as it was a border state, and would have been pretty quickly incorporated into the Union almost as soon as the war started by the incursion of Grant's forces there. So unless there are specific like outliers that I'm aware of, at the very least, the vast majority of Kentucky would have been excluded from the Emancipation Proclamation because of that border state status and not being part of the founding of the Confederacy. As to how the enslavement of people there would have fared or compared to other places, I don't have a ton of specifics, but the key thing to know, I think, is that generally speaking, the Deep South, specifically anywhere that grew sugar or rice, were generally speaking seen as some of the worst places to be enslaved, mainly because of the short life expectancy of the people involved in conducting that growing, which is why I referenced in my original intro the sort of threat of being sold down the river. The reason that was such a threat was because in Kentucky, at least to my knowledge, they were not growing sugar and rice. And so being sold down the river, say to Mississippi or New Orleans is another classic example, would have been seen almost as a death sentence. Even if you did survive, the other part of that threat, of course, is the separation from people. But that could have been accomplished by selling someone to anywhere, not just specifically sort of, quote, down the river. So that's the key sort of takeaway. But this is a really good question. I'm glad somebody asked it, because slavery looks different often in different places. And that is not necessarily to, in some cases, say that it's better or worse, merely to say that it's different. But I don't have a ton of specifics as like comparing Kentucky to like Florida specifically. But yeah, that main takeaway is that Richard was not growing sugar or rice on his plantation in Kentucky. And that would have been sort of a key difference at the very least.
Thanks, Andrew. Yes, slavery is not a monolith. It's all different. Everybody's experience is different. That being said, there's no good slavery, obviously. There's no easy slavery. If you're not free, you're not free. If you're held in bondage, you're held in bondage, no matter where you are.
I taught in Kentucky, and what the teach is that the state is essentially, they break it up into 3 sections. The eastern section, and particularly around the retrieving of slaves who had self-liberated. Eastern Kentucky was very active in tracking down self-liberated slaves. Western Kentucky, sort of around Louisville, because of its location bordering other free states, was a prime area where when they were caught, were returned and held in the western part of the state, specifically Louisville, to be picked up by their former enslavers, to return to them, sort of a holding pen there. There's a big plaque about it. Central Kentucky is neither here nor there regarding this. We associate Mary Todd Lincoln with Central Kentucky. And that's essentially how the culture of slavery was perceived or worked. It was a great economic driver retrieving self-liberated slaves in the state of Kentucky. It didn't have agriculture essentially like the deep southeastern states. Yeah.
Thank you. There is a couple of stories in the book that Dr. Myers talks about of people who self-liberated, self-emancipated themselves from the Blue Spring Farm. So that's a whole interesting other topic there. But let's see if we can move on to Dawn here, and then we'll do more questions after Dawn and Andrew talk.
So I have a slide here with a quote, which I will also read because that helps me focus. And I'm also not very good at sitting still, so bear with me. So this quote is, "We'll never know why Richard never married a white woman. Although Julia Chinn performed all the duties of a wife, Richard could have taken a white wife and still maintained his relationship with Julia like so many of his contemporaries did. benefiting from the intimate and economic labors of both their white wives and their black housekeepers. There were a few times during my reading and my research, I was empathetic toward Richard Mentor Johnson. Melissa and I had a hallway conversation, and then there were other moments when my response to his decisions was really seriously. This quote captured my attention as I was reading Dr. Meyer's book. And I'm gonna circle around to the summertime when Martin Van Buren National Historic Site offers house tours. Most of the time on a house tour, conversation about Richard Mentor Johnson is limited to identifying him as President Van Buren's vice president for 4 years, 1836 to 1840. Publicity about his relationship with Julia Chinn led the Democrats to withdraw support from both Van Buren and Johnson, since they were connected. And Van Buren ran unsuccessfully for his second term without an official vice presidential candidate. That's not the reason he was defeated. There's the Panic of 1837, a little teaser for you to come visit us sometime. Today's discussion has been a welcome opportunity or preparation for the discussion to research the Johnson family in Kentucky with a spotlight on Julia Chinn. And in my section of the presentation here, I'm also going to share, I learned a little bit about Sally Hemings' life story. And a common factor in both Julia and Sally's relationships with their enslavers is that their children were able to live as free individuals. And so I chose this silhouette, and it's described there as a person who's not Julia and a person who's not Sally Hemings, because they're, as Melissa or Zach alluded to, or both of them, that there are not images of these folks, of these individuals. But I needed something to help me focus. So that was when I found this, I was like, oh, this is a win. So Julia, it says they're born around 1790. Dr. Meyer says 1796. And Julia and her brother Daniel lived with their mother Henrietta at Johnson Station, which was the plantation in Scott County, Kentucky, where Julia would spend her childhood. And Julia's training as a house servant began when she was 6 years old. I was thinking about that. That's as if a first grader were moved out of their family home into the enslaver's home, to use the language, and they're put to work. She learned to help cook meals, clean indoor and outdoor spaces, mend, iron, wash clothes, and help take care of children and toddlers. And those are big tasks for a 6-year-old. And that training continued for somewhere close to 8 to 10 years through her teen years. And then Richard Mentor Johnson was given his own plantation by his parents. It would be a Blue Spring Farm, a couple of miles down the road. And it was described in one source as the 2,000-acre plantation. So 100 laborers also gifted to him to maintain the home and the plantation. Julia was, and Zach said this, but 13 or 14 years old, according to oral stories, and was gifted by Richard's mother, Jemima, to be Richard's housekeeper. And in the quote that I was reading, housekeeper is always in quotes, or was in quotes, and that it indicates an intimate relationship between a plantation owner or an enslaver and an enslaved woman. So Julia is, 13 or 14, right? So that's middle school age today, and this is not lost on her that what her role at housekeeper might really mean. Sorry, I scrolled up when I meant to scroll down. So by the age of 18, a little bit of a big jump Okay, so Julia is mother to two, female children, so we're kind of building on each other's conversations here. Imogene was born, in 1812, and, Adeline was born in 1814. And, Richard acknowledged the girls, as his own, which was really unheard of, in the 1800s. So that was part of the reason. I was like, maybe he's not such a bad guy after all. But that was very, very short-lived. For a variety of reasons, which I don't think we have time for to dive into here, but, Julia raised, her, daughters to adulthood while managing the daily operations of the Blue Springs plantation. Richard was away for months at a time pursuing his political career at the state level, and the national level. And, he would benefit from Julia's organizational skills until 1833, when she passed away from cholera, contracted while caring, for individuals during the epidemic, during the cholera epidemic. There, I want to just add a little bit more about her daughters. I gave myself a little note here that, Imogene, as an adult, married Daniel Pence, and she lived until 1883, close by, on property that her father had given to the married couple. And then Adeline, younger sister by 2 years, she was very close to her mother and worked to support the home and the plantation also at Blue Springs Farm. And her marriage, and I guess in a way I'm just throwing names out there, but was to a gentleman named Thomas Scott. And they also had property close by Blue Springs Farm. Adeline, doesn't have the longevity of her sister, and she passed away in 1836. Just a few years after her mom passed away. So that provides a little insight into Julia and her daughters. And then as far as Sally Hemings, she has a similar life story. Was born in 1773 and is, I think this is what you were saying, Thomas Jefferson's daughter, Maria, is not a full sibling, but she is a sibling to Sally Hemings. They have the same father, and it's through it's through Jefferson's wife's side of the family, Martha Wales, if I'm remembering it right. So Sally grows up and she's a sibling to Thomas Jefferson's white children. I think that's what you were saying. As a teenager, so she's pretty close to the same age that Julia was when Julia was gifted to Richard Mentor Johnson. Sally accompanies the members of the Thomas Jefferson's family, including himself, to France and lives there for 2 years. Similar to Julia having her brother Daniel, Sally has her brother James. He also travels to Paris, and an intimate relationship begins between Thomas Jefferson and Sally Hemings in this time frame. When it came time for the family to return to Virginia, Sally could have, and this is a big decision, I think, could have stayed in France and lived her life as a free Black woman. But Thomas Jefferson was pressuring her to return to the United States with his family, and she negotiated freedom for her future children. So this implies that she knew how what the future held for her. That may not be the most eloquent way to say it, but Sally would raise 4 children to adulthood, and I would like to share their names because that is part of the idea of these untold stories, to remember the names of individuals. So there were 3 children in this who were born and died in infancy. Only one, at least in the sources I was looking at, it was given a name, Harriet, and she was the second child born to Sally Hemings, and later on, another sister would also be named Harriet. When Harriet was, passed away, as a 2-year-old. So the ones who live to adulthood include, Beverly, and like, they are and sister Harriet are the 2 older, children born in 1798, and 1801. And, they, learned skills, that would be useful to them as an adult, as adults, and, they left Monticello. I think I forgot a very important piece of the story, but, they left Monticello in the early 1820s, and that was part of the arrangement that, Sally, having negotiated with Thomas Jefferson, not knowing if he would uphold his end of the bargain, but that children would be allowed to, be free at the age of 21. So these 2 older, children left Monticello, and they, severed their ties with, the Jefferson family and did not, share their genealogy. Then there were, 2 younger boys, Madison and Eston, and they, were trained by their Uncle John, Sally's brother, as, carpenters. And they were freed according to Thomas Jefferson's will, in 1826. And they would leave, and, settle in Ohio. And I didn't go any farther, through the generations, knowing, the timing of our presentation today, but, Sally, so these are her 4 children, her goal was accomplished, were, gained their freedom, either because they reached the age of 21 or, when Thomas Jefferson passed away, they were emancipated. For Sally herself, her, story is a little different than Julia Chinn, who was never, emancipated. Sally lived in what was called unofficial freedom, so quotes around this, with one of her sons in Charlottesville, Virginia, until she passed away, in 1835. And Julia and, Sally are the 2 of the many, enslaved women who raised children fathered by their, enslavers. And we, kind of putting us all under an umbrella here, but at Martin February National Historic Site, we're committed to, including their stories with our talks, with our exhibits. Melissa and Zach, did some stellar work last year, and they're still doing stellar work with, exhibits in, our visitor center. And also we all work together. We have another person, I don't know if she's online or not, but our manager, Annette, is part of our group, of course, and we all work on social media posts. So a little, plug there for our, either our Facebook or our Instagram. If you folks are interested in social media, you can keep up. We just did a series for the month of February on free and enslaved Black women from I think mostly from the 1800s. I don't know if I'm out of time or not. It's a little after 3, so you tell me.
Well, you can talk more. Let's have Andrew wrap up. Sort of, he was going to talk about why we don't know more about this story. Why was this story hidden, or people chose not to tell the story, and in some cases, pieces of it were deliberately erased. And then we can sort of all come back and have any more questions or discussion. Andrew, you want to take it away?
Yeah, sure. So we've heard a lot about Julia's story at this point. And it's a story that I think is a lot of things. It's incredibly powerful. I think it's kind of tragic in a lot of ways, but at the same time, I think it's also inspiring in terms of what she manages to accomplish for her children. And the one thing I don't really think it is forgettable. And yet, for a long time, this story was completely unknown. And that sort of defies the notoriety of the story back in the historical context. We already talked a bit about sort of the political cartoons and so on after Julia had passed. But this story was incredibly notable and well known during the rest of Johnson's lifetime, and perhaps a bit beyond at the very least. The original thesis for the program I developed on Johnson and Julia back when I worked at the site was that Johnson is perhaps the most controversial vice president in all of US history. He's the only vice president that the Electoral College voted on and didn't decide was the vice president. It actually fell to the US Senate to determine who the vice president actually was for Martin Van Buren. And the only reason it ended up being Johnson was because Van Buren's Democratic Party happened to have a majority in the Senate at the time. But you know, clearly this, and a big part of that, I should say, was the controversy over Julia and his reputation as a result of that. But the best example I can think of in terms of the notoriety of this story is the original way I stumbled onto all of this was I was actually reading through the Lincoln-Douglas debates from 1858. Stephen Douglas and Abraham Lincoln facing off over really the issue of slavery over a series of debates. And in one of them, Lincoln is defending himself from the charge that he believes in true equality for Black people, which Lincoln asserts that he does not believe in. And he says that the only person he ever knew who did believe in true equality was Colonel Johnson. And the entire crowd bursts out laughing at this statement. And by this point, Johnson had been dead in the ground for 8 years, and Julia had been gone for decades. And yet it was still part of the cultural zeitgeist, if you will, enough that Lincoln could play this for laughs and political advantage in 1858. But that controversy did not translate, it seems, into long-term knowledge. And I mean that in sort of two senses, both in sort of cultural knowledge and academic knowledge. You know, just because something is not culturally well known doesn't mean it's unknown. You know, I can maybe name 5 vice presidents that didn't end up becoming president themselves, but that doesn't mean that those vice presidents are unknown in an academic sense. And consequently, just because something is not academically super well studied doesn't mean it's not sort of widely known across culture. But Johnson and Julia sort of fall into this weird place where they're both. You know, I had never heard of Johnson before I started looking into this story. And Dr. Myers, in my interview with her, mentioned that she had never heard of Julia Chinn or Richard Mentor Johnson before a colleague of hers was actually talking to her about a book that she had written called Great Crossings. And Dr. Myers is an incredibly intelligent scholar, not only of antebellum America, but of enslaved women specifically. And she had never heard of Julia Chinn. And so I think there's this really interesting story to be had here over what we remember as a society, whether that's academic or cultural, and why that may be the case for Julia and for Johnson as an extension of that. One piece that I do want to briefly mention before I sort of leave it more as an open-ended question is sort of what was referenced earlier by, I think it was Zach, that Julia was literate. And we know that because Johnson, in his letters to other people, references letters that Julia wrote him. So, for example, the white headmaster of the Choctaw Academy, Johnson wrote him letters where he says, "Oh, Julia mentioned such and such. Could you please do this?" Or Julia mentioned that Adeline was struggling with this thing in her schooling. Could you please pay more attention to that, etc. But none of those letters survive. And additionally, there is no collection of Johnson's papers anywhere. There is no library or a museum that has a collection of his materials. The only places his writings have survived is in the work, or excuse me, in the collections of other people that he wrote to. And Dr. Myers speculates that the reason for that is that after Johnson dies, I'm a little rough on the specifics, but basically his brothers who survive him, he has 2 that outlive him, have him declared dead without a will, and that he has no surviving descendants or children, both of which are patently untrue. But they basically get all of his remaining property that he had not given away before his death. And she believes that they destroyed basically any collection of papers that he may have had, because of how controversial this relationship and Johnson's life was. And so that sort of partially explains at least sort of the literal silence of where these materials went. But even for the materials that do still exist, it took until Dr. Myers wrote this book really to have anyone looking into Julia Chinn's life. And I think there's really only one or two other sources that talk about Richard Mentor Johnson at all. So you could read everything that's ever been written about the two of them in maybe a day or two. And I think it's important that we stop and think about why that is, what we sort of choose to pay attention to historically, what things we maybe even deliberately choose to forget as a society. Because I think that plays a big role in Julia and Richard and how they're remembered.
Cool. All right, questions, thoughts, comments, anybody? We've got a little time.
I have a comment, just like, I think, and Andrew touched on it, but, I think the significance of Julia and also Sally Hemings is not that they were, you know, raped by their owners. It's that they obviously had some sort of autonomy and leverage over their partners. And the reason that Johnson and Jefferson were given such a hard time was not because they were raping Black women, because everybody did. It was because they kept these women as partners. And I think that's the significance of these stories.
Yeah, that's a great point.
Yeah, in that book, that's what they said, the people in Kentucky are living around that farm where Julia was living. You know, they didn't want her around in town, and they all knew that indeed, she was living with Richard Johnson, they were having sex, they were having kids. And as long as they kept it quiet, it would be okay. And any slave owner could do that, and they didn't really care as long as they didn't advertise. But that's where Richard Johnson got into trouble, because he publicly advertised.
Which is interesting. Not sure what his motivation was
Right.
for that.
Yes.
But it reminds us of Henry Clay, which Dr. Myers brings up a bit as well. Henry Clay, another very famous Kentucky politician, the Great Compromise. He also had a mistress that, or sorry, see, I did it. There was an enslaved woman that he had a relationship with, and had, we think, children by, and at his farm, I forget what it's called, it's right up Ashland, yeah, right up from, it's near Blue Springs. And, you know, Johnson's a huge fan of Henry Clay, but Henry Clay is considered this amazing statesman, and people are huge fans of his and laud him. And yet, the story that I understood, as I understand it, and the Dr. Myers relays, is that when his wife either found out or got fed up with the woman that Clay was in a relationship with, that the enslaved woman, that he sold her and the children literally down the river. As Andrew pointed out, that's a saying that has very dark roots. And it literally means to sell some enslaved people from the Middle South down to the Deep South, where, as he said, it was often a death sentence. So that was Henry Clay's situation, and he didn't talk about it. He didn't publicize it. He had manners, right? He was this sort of horrible conflation in the 19th century between being well behaved and staying in line, staying in your lane, and using that as a way to talk about race. And so the fact that Richard Mentor Johnson was gauche enough, was bold enough, had poor manners enough to be open about his relationship when other people had the good sense to keep it quiet. It's sort of
I have a question. During Thomas Jefferson and Sally Hemings' relationship, was that out in the open or was that hidden?
I can answer that.
Oh, yeah, Andrew has.
So the Jefferson's relationship was not well known at the time, and it actually took until maybe the last 15, 20 years for that relationship to even be accepted as factual by most mainstream historians. So that was not well, I should say it was not well known enough to be like public knowledge, but similarly to Clay's or to Johnson's, it seemed to have been sort of in circulation amongst politicians. There's an alleged quote that Dr. Myers mentions, although neither her or I have been able to find a source for it, that Johnson, when confronted about his relationship, stated something to the effect of, unlike Clay, Jefferson, and Poindexter are the three people he names, I have not hidden my relationship from the eyes of God, and if he judges me for it, I have yet to find out. So that implies, although Jefferson's long dead by the time Johnson says that, that there was at least some knowledge of it, but it does not seem to be anywhere near as open as Johnson was at the time, if that makes sense.
Thank you. And
I
also,
think with the topic of political cartoons, and Jefferson was running for re-election, so it's well known amongst other politicians that Hemmings. And I think also that it was probably a general practice that when there was such an arrangement between an enslaved woman and a white man, that their descendants would destroy all records and documents in order to claim their property and deprive the enslaved person of the property or whatever would have been left to them. And some enslaved women went to court to have those documents in order to keep the property that they had been taking care of. So there's so that practice of destroying the records was to preserve what they felt was their due inheritance and not to have it passed on to the enslaved party and their children.
That's why I think, when you mentioned like Julia's autonomy, like the power that she did have, well, yes, it was limited, it could have gone away, but she still had the authority, different power, different structures of her life and her daughter's lives. Richard might have seen something along those lines happening because he had given some property to Imogene before he was even dead.
yeah, he gave both of his daughters property, knowing that likely after he died, it would be contested if he left it to the will. That's the thing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Also, right after they got married, I remember with Imogene, the day after, they give the farms,
Yeah.
they give the farms to the daughters, right after they get married to, they marry, the men. And,
Yeah, so there is some knowledge that could be likely. I mean, he must have known how his family, he definitely knew how his family felt about it. His mom said Dr. Myers quotes her many times, being upset about Julia. So he must have known how it
Wasn't he actually giving the property to the men
was he actually giving it?
in that dynamic?
Yes,
These women were not allowed to be property owners or holders.
yeah.
And he was actually giving the property to the men they married.
Yeah, that makes sense. That it was not until they were married that they were given to these big. But I guess Julia, Dr. Myers talks about other large gifts of furniture and clothing and things like that. So he was in the habit of giving his daughters, while he was alive, quite a bit of his property. Even a lot of enslaved people too. Both of his daughters and their husbands acquired enslaved people from Richard as a gift.
One more thing, we have time. So, there's a few volunteers that are part sprinkled through the audience, whether they choose to identify themselves or not, but our interpretation at Martin Vineyard National Historic Site has changed over the years, and Henry Clay is a great example of that. And I don't want to give away my age, but when I started working at the park, like Melissa said, Henry Clay, he's a great compromiser. He did all these wonderful things. He kept the union together, like it was all about politics. And then in, I think it's 2009, there was, some research done, and we changed up, the installation of one of the period rooms to reflect, an 1849 visit, by Kentucky Senator Henry Clay. And, we folded in, Andrew, were you here for this? Or we were still doing this when Andrew was working with us too. So, talking to the wall, I know he's there, I know he's there. Yeah, we were, talking about Henry Clay and, in the term of the day, I think was enslaved, serving. Henry Clay traveled with Levi, and, Andrew, and we had some other coworkers at the time, really was, more comfortable than I was jumping into these, stories, and I was trying to figure out, like, how am I going to, share, about Levi? So finally figured it out, that I picture Levi in the formal dining room of Martin Van Buren's house, which is very fancy, on the edge of, conversations, like many other enslaved people would have been, overhearing, these politicians talking about, having conversation that directly affected his future. So that's one of the ways that our, conversations about Henry Clay changed during our house tours. And then now I think they might be about to change again, you know, a little bit. We can figure out how to squeeze, the time out of a house tour to share, a little bit more.
Is it true that Martin Van Buren though really disliked Johnson a lot?
Andrew, what do you think? Did Martin Van Buren dislike, who knows what his vice president?
What was the question? Sorry.
Question was, did Martin Van Buren dislike Richard Mentor Johnson?
So I used to know more specifics about this back when I was doing that program. But
right?
the what I remember is that Van Buren and Johnson spent almost no time together. And whether that was because of sort of a dislike for each other or whether it was just sort of necessity, I don't know for sure. But Johnson actually doesn't even really spend a lot of time, at least from the records that I remember at the time, and this was, 4 years ago now, a lot of time in DC during his vice presidency because of the panic. So the economy really tanks during Van Buren's presidency, and Johnson was already struggling to stay afloat economically. He ends up going back to Kentucky to, I think, run what was called a tavern on his property to try to stay economically solvent. And that being said, when it comes time to run for re-election, Johnson is actually Van Buren's choice to run again. So although he was not in favor of Johnson the first time around, he actually supports Johnson being his vice presidential candidate the second time around. And he has some quote, and I'm not going to get it right off the top of my head because it's been a long time, but he says something to the effect of, whatever Johnson does on his own time is not my business as long as he's doing his job. And so he is actually in favor of Johnson the second time around, but ultimately gets sort of overruled by the party. So he runs without a running mate. Johnson does campaign for himself in that case, but obviously that is not how it works out. So that's what I remember offhand.
Yeah.
I don't want to overcut anything, but before you finish, could you talk a little bit about the principle of reclaiming forgotten stories or lost histories at the site?
At our site?
Yeah.
Yeah, so one of the reasons we're doing this, there's a clear connection that Richard Mentor Johnson was Van Buren's vice president. But also, we're in the process of, trying to reframe our narrative. So if you haven't been to the park in a while or ever, you should, because it's close by. But come see us when it's open again at the end of May. We're trying to do things a little differently, and we are definitely doing a very conscious and deliberate recentering of our interpretive mission. where we want to talk about enslavement. Our site is a site of enslavement, which is not something that we've led with quite often. It's often overshadowed, of course, because it's called Martin Van Buren, and it's a presidential site. But before Van Buren lived there, the house was built in 1797 by enslaved labor, by people that were enslaved by the Van Ness family. That we know a few of their names, you know, George and, Satin, Bet, Non, and Hannah. And then, previous to the Van Ness occupation, there was another Dutch family who were also relatives of Van Buren, the Van Allens, going back to the 1600s. They were also enslavers. So we have a history of enslavement at the site going back since the beginning of the Dutch occupation of this area. And so we are going to definitely tell much more of that story, because there is no Martin Van Buren without the history of Dutch enslavement in the Hudson Valley. And also Martin's entire career is about these two very big issues that our land very much is affected by. It's about Indian removal, and it's about the question of slavery. Those are the two main issues in the 19th century and in Martin's career. And the site that we have currently as Martin Van Buren's National Historic Site was the site that Mohican people lived on and were kind of pushed off of by the Dutch settlers. So we have the land itself is inscribed with these stories. And so we're just gonna be doing a real concerted, deliberate effort to tell that whole story. And so we have some new exhibits, we have new tours, we have a new study we have commissioned. It's been in the works for 2 years, researching the descendants of the enslaved people from our site. And so, yeah, we're working on new archaeology. So we are working on all fronts as much as we can to tell the whole story. And that's something that we're really committed to. And the National Park Service as a whole is going to get there too.
I have another question from someone online. How do we get these types of historic information more widely distributed at this time when politicians and school boards are banning books, especially dealing with topics of this nature?
You guys all go out there and be the ambassador. It's your responsibility to now. You have the story. You have Julia's story.
And I'll be an ambassador now. I recommend this book. You haven't read it. It's called How the Word is Passed by Clint Smith. And Clint Smith is from Louisiana. He's a Black writer. He writes for Atlantic. He grew up, I believe, in Louisiana. He's a PhD in education from Harvard. And what he did was to go around to all of these different sites. The first one is Monticello. And if you read the first chapter, you'll have to read the rest of the book. He did a great job. He's a very good researcher. He documents everything. I highly recommend this, Clint Smith, and it's in this library. That's where I guess when I went to a training, a state training, because I work at Claremont, and we're doing dialogic tours, which is basically a lot of what is happening at Martin Van Buren. And I happened to come, I left the training, came down here, and I said, would you order this book for me? And they said, oh, we have a book. I said, great Kinderhook Memorial Library. This is my own copy, but I recommend it highly.
I have all your, I have all your email addresses, and I will send you one email, exactly one. You're not getting signed up for a newsletter, but I will send everybody who submitted an email address, a list of links, references, stuff we talked about today, to books that we think could help. So yeah, we'll send everyone a list of resources too.
I was just gonna say that, sites like Montpelier, James Madison's estate are leading the way in these conversations. You may recall, if you heard in the news, that Montpelier has a really robust, dynamic, descendant group that is people descended from the enslaved people and people enslaved from, descendants of Madison that work together in a really dynamic collaboration. Arlington House, where the guide is from, has a similar group where the descendants of the Lees and the enslaved people work together as a group and are collectively determining how the stories are told and preserved. So there's there are many new kind of pathways for this information to be shared.
Yeah, I just wanted to still kind of talk about like, you know, like how can we continue to get those stories out there? So, like, I think Don mentioned earlier, like with our social media work, we dedicated this month, I think almost every single post we did, if it wasn't promoting this talk here with Julia, it was talking about maybe lesser known stories of formerly enslaved Black women in the United States. So we had to like Kathy Williams, who served in the, which one was it? Civil War, thank you. Don't know why I can't remember the war name.
Just the big one.
Just the big one, yeah. You have, you know, there's so many different stories about, we have Elizabeth Freeman, who we have on display at our exhibit at the park. Who was the first woman to sue for her freedom in Massachusetts. That was not based on a loophole, but basically Massachusetts Constitution as a whole. That's kind of what we're trying to talk about. So just be present on social media if you have it. I mean, it's not something you have to do. It's something we're doing, something we're taking. We included for the first time ever a land acknowledgement for the Mohican people on our park brochures, as well as on our website. That's new for us. It's just ways we're trying to get these stories out there, people who are coming to our site or swinging by our Facebook and Instagram pages.
And we're all learning together. We just want to invite everybody to be part of that. Hopefully we'll have some more events with the community too, because I think Kinderhook is ready.